we would like to welcome Katharine, Professor Katharine Sarikakis in Budapest at Eötvös, and a few words about her academic and professional experience. Professor Sarikakis researches the political processes and economic dimensions of media and communication governance globally. Her work is informed by political philosophy and investigates the ways in which empowerment and disempowerment of citizens become inherent elements in public policy addressing communication and expression. Professor Sarikakis is the founding co-editor of the International Journal of Media and Cultural Politics. She has also served as the chair of the Communication Law and Policy section of ICREA for 6 years, and she's also a re-elected member of the executive board. Since 2011, Professor Sarikakis joined the University of Vienna, and now she is the vice director of the doctoral programs of the Faculty of Social Sciences. Before that, for about 20 years, she has spent tenured academic years in the UK. And beyond all that, and this is the personal remark, as the doctoral supervisor of many of us in Vienna, she is devoting enormous effort to make us finally understand what the real job of social scientists is. And we are very, very thankful for that. And we are really happy to have you here. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. I learned to say good afternoon in Hungarian, and I already forgot. I think it's it's hopeless. So sorry. So good afternoon, and thank you for coming. You're the brave ones who will go through, not because this is English, but because you're going to be sitting here. I was told I need to speak for a whole hour, 60 minutes. And I'm going to talk about liberty and freedom of expression and governance. I'm just going to make a mess out of this, and I hope we will come out in the end with food for thought. If you feel that it's going too fast, let me know politely. I'll try to slow down. So let me start with this quote by Aristotle. Let's go back to the basics. If liberty and equality, as is thought by some, are chiefly to be found in democracy, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. I think there are some important things here to bear in mind. First of all, that liberty and equality come together. Second, that they are mainly to be found in a regime that is called democracy. And the third thing is that it is a requirement, it is actually a claim, it is a political claim and a goal, and most people should take part in this government to the utmost. That means to the maximum. So tonight I would like to talk about what does it mean to govern freedom. And I understand we are all here media and communication scholars, but for us the stakes of looking at media and communication are bigger than simply issues of what goes into the press or goes into a screen. It is about the basic right to be free, first of all, and be free to participate in the public domain. Let me start with this. So about a year ago, this picture made traveled around the world. This is these are the gates of the public service broadcaster headquarters in Athens. And it is a telling picture. First of all, it denotes of violence because the riot police gear is right behind the gates, as you can see. Second, it denotes the symbolic as well as practical, if you like, structural silencing of critical journalism on the one hand, that journalists, for example, and other workers in the public service broadcaster were practicing, but at the same time, it shows that it is the silencing of a society's dissent and discontent with public policy. This is a public service broadcaster, and it was closed down, meaning that something was taken away from the people. This picture, this image has, as I said, gone around the world. It is, I think, very important to bear in mind that this picture was taken first, if you like, at the cradle of democracy, as we used to refer to Greece, as of course, this, with this attribute. And at the same time, in a country that belongs to the European Union. The European Union is a zone, political and cultural, that goes out there into the world and preaches human rights and freedoms. What I'm going to do in the next 55 minutes or longer, that's the threat, is to theorize a little bit with you about what is freedom, then have a quick look at what are the human rights that are related to the human right of freedom of expression, then look at the concept of governance and why is it of any use to us and why should we be bothered. And finally, I'm going to look at 3 different cases very briefly as examples so that we can apply the theory, if you like. As we academics like to think, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So, I'm not going to give you a review of what freedom means, but I'm going to stay here with Aristotle and go a little bit through what he said that freedom means and how he has used it in his works. So freedom, eleftheria, is a concept that in its political meaning denotes a citizen. This is important. Citizen is someone who has rights, first of all, and duties, and it's a public person. In order to be a public person, however, a citizen also needs to have privacy. We will see that in a minute. Eleftheria is formed on the basis of democratic equality, and this means that if you're born eleftheros, meaning free, it means to be born equal. So it is a right that is a natural right. It is a state that is a natural state. And as you will see, human rights derive from these considerations. Now we know, of course, that in ancient Greece, citizenship is something that we see in a contested way, that only men had the right to participate in the agora and the polis. This is not the whole story, however. If we want to complete the story, we need to mention also that even slaves could make themselves free citizens, into free citizens, and women would also participate in other cultural public events. Now, Aristotle also uses the concept of eleftheria, freedom, to contrast democracy versus tyranny. And tyranny means here to be subjected to a despotic ruler. And this is a very interesting point for our days, because even democratic states, the citizens of democratic states nowadays, are being subjected to despotic rulers. And here is the interesting thing. It is transported from the microcosmos of IKEA, that is a home, meaning the private sphere, to the macrocosmos, the city-state, the polis, where decisions are made and public affairs and public issues of public interest are discussed. Hence we have this connection of the private to the public. Indeed, without this separation and connection, there is no such thing as either citizenship or freedom. Now, when it comes to freedom of expression, Aristotle also had something to say. freedom was associated with a very important act, the freedom to speak one's mind, parisia in Greek, meaning to have the, to be brave enough to express your opinion. So again, it relates the private realm and privacy to the right to live as one pleases, without interventions, of course with the exception of democratic rule. And there's another way of being free to speak, which is isigoria, which is the right of all citizens to talk about public affairs. So the right to freedom of expression is double, if you like. On the one hand, it's connected with a private life, meaning also the private thoughts we might have, the things we think about and also regret, and how these things and these thoughts are then transposed into the public domain. Let's go back to what Aristotle said about liberty and equality. Let's remember a little bit the main points. That if these are the highest values, then they have to be best, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. This is very important because eleftheria, freedom for Aristotle, also denoted the poor citizens as opposed to the rich ones, meaning democracy versus oligarchy. So it was a juxtaposition, therefore, and in his note to Democritus, he said, poverty under democracy is preferable than so-called prosperity under dynasts to the same extent as freedom is preferable to slavery. You see here, there's a mashup here, and I think it has to do with my change of systems. So it's better to be poor under democracy than to be in a so-called wealthy state, but under the rule of oligarchy. Let's recap what freedom is, according to Aristotle. It's a political participation, therefore participation in decision-making about public affairs. It does relate to public and private, and it does have to do with self-governance, so our right to live the way we want. It does have to do with how we express ourselves in both domains. It does address social inequality, and it does have a political claim, which is fairness, and he says to rule and to be ruled in turns. Let's see what this means for our times. The Article 19 is the article that, of course, in the Human Rights Convention speaks about freedom of expression. I know you know it, we'll just I'm just putting it here to remind ourselves, but it has some important points. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. I want to stay here for just a second to say, in order to form an opinion, one needs space. This space can be private or of controlled public space. This private space, as Brandes, for example, when he was looking at privacy in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, the aim here for this space to form an opinion and change your opinion is to be free from interventions and interferences. Here, the Article 19 says this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information. So, three actions: seeking information, the freedom to seek information, actively looking for information. You are free to do it, should be free to do it. To receive by a third party, and to impart, share this information, regardless of frontiers. Article 19 expects that authorities will defend this right, even when they have to defend it against themselves, meaning that a state is obliged to defend this right, even if it goes against its own interests. Habermas, talking about the ideal speech situation, I'm sure you're sick of hearing about Habermas. All I want to say here really is that he has tried to describe the conditions under which perhaps this right can be best applied, he came up with this list. What is important here to bear in mind perhaps is that one of the important things is to not be afraid to speak your mind, to have access to the same kind of information that others have. This is important. That every topic is to be discussed. There are no taboos, no religion, no state and nationality, nationalism, no identity, none of these issues to be taboos, issues or institutions, and to be able to question all kinds of assertions. This, of course, proposal by Habermas has been criticized heavily, and quite rightly so. But we're not going to go into this tonight. You can discuss it some other time, or we can discuss some other time. But what is important here, I think, to keep in mind is that there are some important structural conditions, and some he's mentioning even immaterial. The structural conditions are that everybody has access to the same kind of information. Okay, this is a structural matter. And the immaterial, so to speak, is the absence of fear, which is very important. Because under fear, there is no free speech or ideal speech. So if we look at, if we recall the Article 19, and we take Habermas's conditions of how one can exercise such a speech, and we look at the Human Rights Charter, if you like, what other human rights are related to this? So we have several rights that are fundamentally necessary for the practice of freedom of expression to exist. Okay, the first one is obviously the right to life, liberty and security of person. Right to life. This is why I'm not going to analyze all that, but I'm just going to make connections. I'm going to make links for you to see at the multiple levels how the human rights work at multiple levels. So it's without the right to life, for example, you don't have obviously free speech. I mean, the Charlie Hebdo case is the most recent and obvious European case in front of our eyes. Having said that, hate speech, regulation of hate speech relates directly to this. If hate speech causes the loss of life, for example, we're talking about violations of human rights, to say the least. Another one is the right to assembly and association. Why is this relevant? Because free speech and speech is exercised not only through the media, or any kind of medium, whether written or visual, but also oral, and also by the very right to come together with others, to seek information, to impart information. So the demonstrations that took place yesterday across Europe, for example, to support anti-austerity, the anti-austerity efforts of the Greek government, or anyway of the Greek people, in 30 cities across Europe, were exactly about this. First of all, it was the exercise of this particular right to assembly, but also the right to express your opinion, express the dissent, and also a third right to take part in government. There's a list here of directly related rights. The right to privacy is one that to which I referred, and I'm going to refer also a bit later. Of course, freedom of movement, because the right to freedom of expression clearly says, regardless of borders, one is to seek information. But also there's something interesting going on here, because we have rights that relate to the cultural dimension of our existence. And the reason why these are related to freedom of expression is because an aspect of self-governance involves, of course, the literature, the arts, and so on, but also the body. So it is important to remember that even the body is a part of this of practicing freedom of expression, because it conveys messages that are cultural, of course, ideological, and so on and so forth. If you look at Article 22, and I'm going to move on from here, this article speaks about the necessity for the whole system conditions that must be in place for people to develop their personality. So economic, social, and cultural rights are important for a human being to develop their individuality, their personality, and to do this freely. So let's recap. Freedom of expression is not simply about giving you my opinion, but it is also about developing who I am. It's about the individual's welfare as well as society's. It is about the political role that people have in society, to take part in government, for example, and in decisions that affect them and their communities, and the right, of course, to dissent. And I think this is the big test. The big test is always where this content is expressed and where dissent is allowed to be seen. And why should we be bothered with governance? Very briefly, the word governance has come actually to replace, not replace, has come to express the increased complexity in managing communicative spaces, including media. So it has its origins in the world of politics with the UN Commission on the initiative on global governance. And it makes, using this concept is making assumptions about it. For example, we think that governance, we assume that governance is about management and steering, and in many cases, in a big part of the literature, it's something that we assume is separate from politics. And governance always, sometimes is assumed to be good and open. Why? Because it's not the closed system of government, which is something different, as we know. Anybody needs to breathe? So, in communication and media, we denote a few things with the term governance. We denote a process. So when we study it or when we talk about it, it's about a process, and not necessarily of an outcome. It's, as I mentioned, drift away from government, because government is not the only actor in making decisions about media. It brings our attention to the multi-level dimension, the fact that it's a process that is multi-level, it is multi-actor, and has multi-purpose, many purposes, not only one. Of course, regulation remains at the heart of governance. Nevertheless, I'm going to mess it up a little bit for everyone. Yeah, of course I have to say this. It's not about boasting, but yours truly was one of the first who started discussing media governance. So I want to mess it up a little bit. I'm going to give you some names. Some of you might be aware of these names, some may not. I am not happy with the way in which the mainstream of our scholarship looks at governance. First of all, it is not possible to talk about policy making and regulation without referring to power and power relations. That is one thing. The other thing is that we are so fixated with institutions, and by the way, I love institutions, that's what I do, but we're so fixated with that we forget the citizen. What is the purpose of looking at institutions if our standard is not to look at what they do to the citizen? And one of the questions that the French Regulation School or French Regularization School poses is, how is it possible that capitalism keeps existing, keeps turning, despite the crisis, or any crisis, and all crises? Because if you remember, the idea is that after a big crisis, capitalism will collapse and so on and so forth. So their question, they're all economists by the way, is how is it possible that this particular economic system keeps on existing and moving despite the fact that it goes through crisis again and again. And we are now in a phase of protracted, of extended crisis. The second example I have here is this analytical compass of social justice. Why? Because I think when we analyze what's going on in the economic world, for example, or in the structural world, in the media, we need to have a standard according to which we will make our analysis, for example. And this is where the academe, for example, and the so-called practical wisdom that Aristotle has written, obviously, about. This is where they come together. Social justice is not only a theoretical enigma, if you like, but it's also a political claim. And if we want people to participate in the government, social justice must be in existence, must be pursued, must be a political goal and claim. Therefore, this participation in the public domain must be seen as a form of public speech, as, of course, other forms of speech, such as the ones that come through newspapers. So it's not the individual only, but also the institutional. So the content that exists in the press, the content in television, for example, and other media, is also part of shaping communicative spaces. It's also part of public speech. So what I want to actually emphasize here is that it's not a matter of individual rights only, the freedom of expression, but it's also a matter of social, community, and institutional dimensions of how public speech operates. From all this here, all I want you to perhaps pay attention to, what for me is important at this point, is how to connect the macro level of institutions and structures to the micro level of citizens. So how do you connect the macrocosmos to the microcosmos? And the question, of course, there is very closely related to the issue of power, whether citizens are empowered or disempowered through actions and decisions that institutions are engaged in. Therefore, what interests me, for example, in the way in which I approach my studies and my research is to find out the extent to which and the ways in which governance, and I'll give you a list of actually what I think governance is, disturbs or accommodates power relations between institutions and citizens and among social constituencies. So what happens in society and what happens between citizens and institutions through governance is power disturbed or being accommodated. And here, don't forget, the media are institutions. Okay? And here's where I'm messing up everything. There's a lot of critique in our scholarship. People say governance is a concept that says a lot and nothing. Governance is a concept that we cannot tame. How do we develop methods to research governance? We have to limit it, we have to make it smaller, more concrete, more everything. And I'm saying no, go the other way. actually. Actually, governance is about many more things than simply looking at outcomes at specific moments in a process or specific actors. It is messier and unruly, and perhaps it's better this way because social life is like this. So I'm saying here, governance involves, if you look these processes through the lens of governance, it does involve practices and codes that have a regulatory effect. They shape not only our media as technologies or objects, but also our communicative spaces, whether these are online or offline. Whether you're participating on Twitter and social media, for example, or whether you're out on the squares and the streets. The governance of speech, which becomes public speech the moment that you leave your private realm, you decide that the realm you are engaged in is not private anymore, becomes public speech. And governance is about many things. It's about practices and codes, but it's also about ideas, values, and principles in the cultural and material realm. It is engaged, it is related to symbolic dimensions of policy making. Of course, also, it's related to the things that we know or we have accepted as in our scholarship. It's about conditions of policy making processes, institutional structure, but also this question of legitimacy. And this is an interesting point to stay for a second. If you work on policy making and regulation, for example, one of the things that you're looking at is these stages of making policy, because we have to tame the beast a little bit. We have to separate it in pieces that we can then study. And usually, mainstream scholarship tells us it all starts with the problem and the agenda setting. I mean, policy comes to give an answer to a problem, right? For example, in Hungary, very recently, there was this suggestion by the government that everybody should pay tax for the use of internet. I'm expecting more reactions to that. So the government started from a place of a problem. And this is the stage of agenda setting. So this problem, therefore, the suggestion to solve this problem, I'm not sure what the problem was, but there was a problem. So the solution to this problem was tax it. Internet tax, maybe because other media are also taxed, perhaps. The usage of other media is also taxed. Maybe it could have been a consideration about content be free, and through tax, people's authors would get some of these levies back. Maybe it was the advertising thing that a lot of business was going on there without contributing to the state. We're taking it at face value, okay? But the question here is, what kind of voices contributed to the formulation of this problem? Second, what kind of voices, which actors contributed to providing solution to this problem? This is the question of legitimacy, you see. Okay, I'm not going to do a case study here. You can do it yourself. So the idea here is that the idea is that these spaces where governance is taking place and the spaces that practices have a regulatory effect upon these spaces, they become increasingly difficult for citizens to manage. If you remember, one of the political claims and expectations is that citizens participate in government. In order to do that, they need specific conditions. No matter how much we would criticize them, we add more, we draw attention to other dimensions, so on and so forth, what we agree about is that certain conditions have to be met for the maximum of citizens to participate to the utmost of government. And what happens now is that a lot of these institutional arrangements, as well as the intangible aspects of doing policy, are distanced from citizens, both geographically, I'll explain everything, also processually. So, for example, we have been seeing an increasing amount of policy, especially related to the internet, that is packaged and included in policies that have nothing to do with the internet or with freedom of expression or media communications. For example, in Spain, you would have, for example, a law about illegal, I'll put it in quotation marks, downloading of copyrighted material, or let's say about downloading of copyrighted material without words with quotation marks, that was put in a bill of economy, I think, or development, something like this. We have seen it in many places of the world, and these new packages of regulation do some interesting things. First of all, they change jurisdictions. We know that courts make decisions about, whether there's a right to be exercised, whether it has been violated, and so on and so forth. It is the courts that make the decisions whether something, a medium, will be switched off or not. In the case of the internet, however, it is not the courts anymore that are doing this. So, I'm coming with an example later. Another dimension of this difficulty of how these processes that citizens are mostly familiar with is when these developments are distanced from what we know, what we're familiar with, both geographically, but also, as I said, in terms of institutions. And the other thing is that national sovereignty that we thought is the main thing that's going on in policy making and governance is not the only prerequisite, if you like. It's not the only condition that exists when looking at how media are being shaped today. We have private interest in public policy, which by itself is an oxymoron. Public policy is there to cater for public interest. Again, if we go back to Habermas, and I know you'll be hating me by the end of this for raising this name so many times, one could talk about a colonization of the policymaking spaces, because private interests, the private actors are in these partnerships, so-called partnerships, with public institutions to do public policy. The question here is public policy addressing diffuse interests, or is it addressing concentrated interests? Is public policy, because media and communication is public policy. This is the question for us. This is a map, this is an interesting map that looks at the censorship, internet censorship in the world. And the pink parts indicate pervasive censorship. Okay. Interestingly, the US is pink here. And the UK is pink here. The very light pink is about substantial censorship. And these are largely East Asian countries. There's a light yellow, which is about selective censorship. I think Italy belongs there. Turkey is under that, I believe. And bright yellow is changing situation. That's interesting. We don't know which direction. It's going to get more pink or more green. Green is apparently little or no censorship. Again, all these things are. But this is an interesting map to keep in mind because the assumption always is that the internet is not regulated. I spoke about privacy. And one of the interesting things is that our neighbors I can't say Macedonia, I come from Greece, I have to say the full name. So, former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia. Okay. Until it formally becomes only Macedonia, this is what I am using. It is interesting because there's been a lot of concern about mass surveillance in the country. A survey published a few months ago shows that people are afraid to express their opinions. This is a 53% and 64% think that they are being exposed to state surveillance. What does this do to freedom of expression? There's some examples. But also in Canada. If you remember, Canada is in green in the map. Of those surveyed, 9 in 10 Canadians were concerned about privacy. 1 in 3 said they were extremely concerned, and this is significantly higher than 2012. And according to the Privacy Commissioner, 60% of Canadians say they have little expectation of privacy today. What does this mean for our exercising freedom of expression, forming opinion, expressing dissent, discontent, in forming assemblies, going to the street, expressing our opinion on Twitter, for example? It means that the Pan American Center says that they've done also a survey and they looked at writers across liberal democratic countries, and all of them, or the majority of them, said that they have self-censored the ways in which they write things because they are aware that what they write is recorded, is monitored, or could be monitored and recorded. Meaning, both the privacy of these people, of everyone actually who's a communicator, is affected, plus when you have systems that monitor systematically what you do, then of course it affects the way in which your decisions you make, whether you will express yourself or not. I have no watch with me, so I'm just talking. And another interesting number here is the Freedom House's very important reports that come up every year. They're being produced every year about freedom in the world. This is very interesting and very important. And in terms of global press freedom, there are different categories, and their writers said that in free countries, more than a third of the writers in free countries, which where the press is free, said that they had avoided writing or speaking on a particular topic, or had seriously considered it due to concerns about surveillance. I would like to move on to another dimension. What happens to governance and freedom in times of crisis? How much do I have? So, and before we go there, everybody talks about a crisis. Okay, the media talk about a Greek crisis. Let's do this a bit more sophisticated. So what are crises? Habermas, sorry, I think it's the last time I'm mentioning Habermas says that crises are structurally inherent contradictions and that can occur in both system and life world. Klaus Offer says that crises are processes in which the structure of the system is called into question. And Anton Ben talks about the state of exception, the state of emergency that is to be found in crisis conditions. And this is one of the most crucial, I think, contributions, because he talks about a place devoid of law, the suspension of democratic processes. You can ask me if you're interested in this, but I can tell you now, this has been the Greek experience since 2008. The suspension of law and the suspension of democratic processes. We have done a lot of research on the ways in which elite presses in Europe have referred to the crisis and to the European identity in specific moments in time. We looked at six countries, and we looked at their best newspapers. In Austria, the Standard, for example. We looked at Zeit, for example, in Germany. We looked at the UK, France, Spain, obviously, and Greece. And although there are many differences, of course, and most of the reportings derive from nationalistic perspectives, there is a clear European public sphere going on, not of the good sort, I have to say. We have found some interesting, perhaps, elements here that I'd like to share with you. And I would like to share with you these findings as parts of the governance of communicative spaces. And you can think, what on earth does privacy have to do with what the media say about the crisis? And wait a second, I'm coming to an issue of copyright later. So these three totally, seemingly unrelated areas have been the objects of our study in my team, and I will explain why. Let me tell you first what we found. You might be surprised. Let me go first to the findings. We might be surprised or might not be surprised to hear that of course, all the newspapers, they take a national standpoint to the crisis. Fine, we expect that. But we see a representation of people and countries as opposed to each other in combating terms. And we see a representation of Europe across groups of bad and good Europeans. I'll let you guess which ones are the bad ones. Interestingly, probably, I'm sure you know very well that when we discuss journalism, journalistic practices, one of the no-go thing that does not exist in the code of how to do journalism, the ethics of journalism, is moral judgment, right? The responsibility is perhaps, of course, to express opinion, but not to make a moral judgment, but to state the facts in an objective manner and as neutral as possible. We found, of course, almost of course, that the basis of the reporting of the crisis and the European Union has been moral judgment. And I bet, and I don't think it's necessary to bet on anything. We haven't done the research as such, to count and code, but we have been following the news so closely from 2010 onwards that these moral judgments that concentrate on individuals' wrongdoings reflect disturbingly what elites say. And this, of course, makes us ask the question, is the press indeed the fourth estate? How free is the press? Who shapes and in what ways our mediated communicative spaces through which citizens are called to participate and make decisions for the public good and decisions about issues of public interest? Other findings are, the problem of the euro, the bailout punishment situation. In terms of understandings of Europe, Europe is a community. We see an agora of nation states in the press, not an agora of citizens. Nowhere in the newspapers, with very few exceptions, and these are the elite presses, the opinion makers, nowhere did we see that Europe is a space where citizens come together. Nowhere did we see that Europe is the polis. Okay, some of you will say, okay, we know that, so. Well, the answer is, if the European Union institutions and the states have been putting in so much effort and financial and other resources to overcome the criticism of their democratic deficit. And when through these resources and strategies, they are trying to convince Europeans, first of all, that they are Europeans, they should feel they belong to a bigger family, first. Second, that the Union, as a matter of fact, has no democratic deficit because it has all these democratic institutions. Then we have a problem. Either the communication strategy hasn't worked out, or taking into account the fact that journalism and elite politicians of these kinds of institutions speak the same language, this is the true kind of face of the Europe as it is arranged now at this level. And to finish this is to say that whenever, of course, citizens were mentioned and taken into account in all these reportings in 2012 and from then onwards, they were referred to as victims. Why is this important? Why is it a problem that all these presses, the opinion-making presses, the elite presses, we're not talking about the Bild Zeitung, no. We're not talking about the Kronen Zeitung, no. We're not talking about the Sun in the UK, no. We're talking about Telegraph, we're talking about the Zeit, Standard, you know, El País. We're talking about the serious players. What happens if all of them say the same things, with the exception that obviously they say the same things that elites say? What are the implications? I think this quote by John Stuart Mill is very interesting, because he says provocatively and almost romantically, one can say, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power in silencing mankind. In our analysis as scholars, but also as media workers and practitioners, but also as citizens, we, that is my personal standpoint, cannot afford to be cynical. We cannot afford to give up. We cannot afford to simply accept what is. We have to keep questioning. We have to keep our critique alive. We have to take these powers, these situations, these conditions, these actors, we have to keep them accountable to what they do. So the European Union, for example, says we don't have the democratic deficit, we are all in this together, we are a community, and so on and so forth. If you say so, I take it at face value. And now we have to deconstruct it. I said it's going to be the last time I mentioned Habermas, but you know, Habermas is doing it also. You have to take these claims at face value and then deconstruct them. So this is the third irrelevant part to the other two parts, which is about copyright. I'm sure you know all the story with Charlie Hebdo, and everybody's saying even those politicians whose countries actually have suffered massively of press unfreedom, like Greece, for example, fallen off the ranks fastly and painfully in the past 7 years. Everybody says I am Charlie Hebdo. Actually, you're not. And the French government, as a matter of fact, while this has happened, has decided to do something that is exactly the opposite of supporting freedom of expression. take a step back, take a deep breath. Copyright. Copyright can be such a boring subject, I know. And it didn't used to bother us. Oh, you know what? Privacy did not used to bother us either. Yeah, privacy was something that celebrities or politicians had to deal with, and not the everyday people. But now everybody is somehow affected, right? Copyright is exactly the same. It's beautiful, actually. Copyright didn't used to be our concern, but it is now. It is now because people expect, the culture of citizens expect the internet to give them something for free. Information is for free. And also sharing should be free, and so on. Only certain partners in the policy making do not see it this way. So in the past 5 years or 10 years, the max, we have seen many interesting things happening with copyright. We have seen emergence of the copyright regime on a global level. And these are some of the moments of copyright policy initiatives. The ACTA, I don't need to talk to you about. In all these cases, you need to think what the public has done. You know? So in your case, the internet tax, have people gone to the streets? Have people criticized? What happened? In the case of ACTA, SOPA and PIPA too, what have people done across the world? So there are some interesting things here going on. I want to give you an example of the Los Inde only, the Spanish case, and the French case. So this is the 301 report, a special 301 report that the US, the Office of Trade Representatives, put together every year. This is from April 2012, and basically what they say is this and this and this and this in this country are bad because they do not enforce copyright legislation the way we see it fit. This and this and this and this is good, they do it. For 3 or 4 years in a row, there's been enormous pressure on Spain to change its copyright legislation. And this is the last kind of straw on the camel's back, so to say. This is when they say, this is when it finishes. Spain has adopted new legislation. We applaud it. It's wonderful. But at the same time, Spain needs to do more things. What happens is that Spain then moved into changing its copyright law. I'm not going to go into the detail how and why and so forth, but the important things of that is the following. The new law does two things. A, allows for the interruption of services to internet users. Okay? So I cut you off from the flow of information. The second is, courts are not needed to do that. They are needed at some point, but not in the first instance. So as you see, the institutions that citizens know that they are responsible to deal with these issues are taken out of the equation. French administrative approach. This is a few days old. They can now force ISPs to block websites without a court order. And ISPs will be reversed for the costs and rules. Civil society representatives such as Felix Trigger says the measure only gives the illusion that the state is acting for our safety while going one step further in undermining fundamental rights online. Oh, I need to say, of course, the only way that we know about what happened to Spain, for example, is through the WikiLeaks, just as a note. Returning to the state of the world, and you'll be so happy to know that I think, no, you won't be very happy. I still have some stuff to say, but anyway, this we have to, these kinds of examples of governance have to be included in our understanding of how global governance of freedom of expression is practiced. Again, some examples here, but they're not exhaustive, of course, but they tell you that freedom in general, the level of freedom across the world has fallen. And new laws, as the Freedom House reports, criminalize online dissent. And this is very problematic, of course. This is one point. There's some key findings from these reports. We don't need to go, of course, through all of them, but it's important to bear in mind that these practices do not happen isolated in one country only, for example, one or two. Instead, there's a policy spillover, there's a policy transfer, so we have specific principles decided at remote spaces, and then these principles of how copyright, for example, or privacy, or freedom of expression will be applied in law, will then be applied in many more contexts with some differences, but the principles remain the same. Many issues going on here. Please go online to have a look. All kinds of dimensions are very problematic. This is the oxymoron of our times. On the one hand, we have the borderlessness, the timelessness, yeah, almost even the ubiquitousness of information, of access, of all of that. And at the same time, while this is happening, states and actors, not only public actors but also private actors, aim to curtail and control what users and citizens are doing with these possibilities. Why is a big question. A wild guess is because citizens can be freer than they are, and therefore unpredictable, more powerful. They will have no fear. If you have no fear, you dare to say, you dare to dream, you dare to demand. And you know what happens in the world, so I'm not going to tell you what globalization means. Just to keep in mind this multi-level dimension of governance, multi-stakeholder, as we say, multi-directional, and the assumption that we are moving into, you know, an opener, freer, more democratic way of doing things. Actually, no. This is not what's happening. We see a push and pull. We see elites becoming more tyrannic, if you allow me the expression, more authoritarian. The power is concentrated even more among groups that are self-defined, elite groups self-defined as technocrats, experts, and makers, and so on, plus the market. Policy processes, although we're being told this is more democratized now because more stakeholders participate in debates, as a matter of fact, policy processes do not involve citizenship and citizens' participation, and if they do, it is in a way that it neutralizes these debates. And the involvement of civil society, again, is problematic. Problematic in the sense that, on the one hand, there are so many spaces constructed, if you like, for civil society to interfere, and without it, we would have been totally lost, that's true. But at the same time, there are increased efforts to control the ways in which civil society will participate. Here's from yesterday. That's from yesterday. The point here is to remind ourselves that communication freedom is about communicative spaces, online and offline, and that we should not be separating the two. It's about regulations, it's about actors, and it's about values and principles. So in here, for example, in these particular cases, we had demands on the one hand for social justice, and on the other hand, you have something, again, oxymoron that you see, which is at the grassroots level, more dialogue and transnational cooperation, if you like, and at the elite level, polarization. So, you'll be happy to hear, this is my last slide actually. I'll finish with this question actually. We have been, in our scholarship, we have been discussing a lot how the concept of governance allows us to include all these unruly and informal and intangible aspects of making policy and regulating the media and therefore everyday lives. Some of us also try to connect the macro with the micro. There have been many structural but also institutional changes in the past 10 years. We have more involvement with public civil society. We have more open spaces to discuss and debate policy. We have seen more and more people going to the streets to disagree with media policy. This did not used to be the case. But at the same time, what is going on? At the level of policy objects, what is happening is that policy areas intersect. In order to reinforce and enforce copyright law, you have to violate privacy. Okay? In order to be able to apply specific policies, even if these are about something irrelevant to media policy, you have to have content that legitimizes specific voices. So we are now in a situation as scholars where we have extremely, I think, or increased difficulties and complexities. But that's okay, because we're not journalists. We don't have to simplify things. What we have to do is to show complexity. So we need to ask questions, I think, from the perspective of the citizen. We have to ask questions, I think, from the perspective of the most marginalized citizens. I think we should apply a margins-activated research approach to our questions. This means that we put ourselves and we listen to, we put ourselves in the place of groups of society that are the most marginalized, most negatively affected by the status quo, by what is now, listen to their experiences, and from there design research and seek theory and build theory that will allow us to raise the marginalized groups to a better position, to a better quality of life. Once we do that, we do that for the rest of the citizens. Thank you.